Today's scripture passage is Mark 15:20 through 39. You're invited to turn there in your own Bible or follow along on the screen. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. They led him out to crucify him. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his own way from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine and mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it, and they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge was against him was read, King of the Jews. They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on the right and one on the left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe. Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." Someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down," he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." This is God's word.
Greater love hath no man than this. The words of the Apostle John as he contemplated what Jesus had done for him and for us on the cross. Now, the narrative that we've just read together is the self-giving of Jesus reaching its fullest expression. And frankly, it's an unsettling text to read. It's not an encouraging one. It's not a happy one, but it's an important passage. It's an important thing that we engage this passage if we're going to understand certain things, like the depth of our human problem, the love of God, and the justice of God, and how all of those things relate. How do they come together? Where do they intersect? As we saw last Sunday, Pilate had acquiesced to the pressure of the Jewish Sanhedrin, and he had handed over Jesus to the Roman death squad. So when it came down to it, we noted that Pilate had caved to expediency rather than pursuing what was just, because he was condemning to death a man who he knew to be innocent. So he turned Jesus over to the soldiers for crucifixion. The soldiers first beat him, and then they mocked him, and then they led him out to be crucified. Now, we'll sometimes use that word crucified when we talk about a person maybe who got up in front of a bunch of people and completely flopped. How did it go? "Oh, they crucified me." It's not a very pleasant word. It drips with darkness. It drips with brutality. That's why it means what it means to us. Now, I thought about crucifixion a lot this week as I was poring over this passage and trying to figure out what I want to say about it this morning. One of the things that occurred to me is that the route that was chosen to the crucifixion site, it was chosen, of course, by the soldiers who were in charge of the crucifixion. It was made deliberately and unnecessarily long and circuitous. Have you ever asked yourself why that would have been? Well, it would have been so that the streets would be filled with onlookers. It was meant to be humiliating for the person who was being led out to be crucified. Deliberately humiliating. And as this gruesome, macabre procession would wend its way through the streets of town towards the city gates, crowds would gather to taunt and to jeer the person who was being condemned. Remember, crucifixion was intended to be a spectacle. It was not to be done somewhere privately where people wouldn't see it or hear about it. It was a deliberate spectacle. Now, the victim, or the person who was appointed to walk ahead a little bit, sort of as a herald, would bear a placard citing for everybody to read the charges of which the victim had been condemned. Now, here's a photo of what this sign that Jesus bore may have looked like. Mark tells us that in Jesus' case, the placard bore the words, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And we are told that that was printed in 3 different languages, Aramaic, in Hebrew, and in Latin. Actually, I think one of them was actually Greek, and it wasn't Aramaic, it was Greek. And the point was that everybody who could read any language would be clearly understanding what the charges were. Now, I remember it wasn't but just a few years ago that it dawned on me what was happening here in this placard being written the way it was. Pilate had ordered that the placard would read King of the Jews. And it finally dawned on me that Pilate is taking a vicious, brutal swipe at the Jewish leaders by sentencing Jesus with a placard that says King of the Jews. It's as if Pilate was saying, some people you all are. This is your king. How powerful is he? How adored is he? Look at him. And when the Jewish Sanhedrin recognized what was going on with the placard, they were furious, and they in a rage stormed Pilate's office and made a demand that the language be changed to include the words, he claimed to be. But Pilate wasn't having it. I think Pilate was reveling in his very clever insult of the Jewish people at the moment. And so when you think about all this, you realize that Jesus, the Lord of glory now, is being turned into a pawn, being used by 2 different people groups to lob insults at each other. How undignified. And Jesus accepts it and endures it. The criminal condemned to crucifixion was forced by the Romans to carry his own crossbeam across his back and shoulders, which, by the way, would have already been ripped to shreds by the preceding flogging. And I put a picture up here, an image that might have depicted what it might have looked like for Christ, carrying his own crossbeam through town. Now, tradition tells us that Jesus was so badly beaten and so depleted that he was unable to continue under the weight of that beam, and at one point collapsed beneath it. Thus, Mark records these words for us. This is verse 21 of chapter 15. A certain man from Cyrene, we pronounce it Cyrene, it was probably Kyrene, something like that. A certain man from Cyrene, Kyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. Now, I tried to put myself in Simon's shoes throughout the week and wonder what might have been going on inside of him. I wondered, was it a curse for him to have to carry this nasty thing for Jesus? Or did he view it as a blessing that he was able to minister to one who needed his help? And it could have been a confused mix, probably some of both. Imagine being both an accomplice to the crucifixion of Jesus and a ministrant serving Jesus at the same time. That's kind of complicated. How do you work that through? And here Simon finds himself. Now, I find it interesting that Simon is even introduced at this point. And I got to tell you, what seems like a little sideline really bears a lot of discussion if you dig into this a little bit. And I wanted to probe this a little bit because there's more here than meets the eye at first. Did you notice that Mark mentions 2 sons of Simon? He names them, Alexander and Rufus. Have you ever noticed that? Then have you ever asked yourself, why did Mark bother to mention them? Was that meaningful to somebody? Now, you and I don't know Alexander and Rufus. Why would Mark have mentioned them? Now, here we got to read between the lines a little bit, and I find this fascinating. So, Simon is a North African Jew. He's from this place called Kyrene. And that happens to be in what we would know today as Libya, of all places. So Simon from Libya is a long way from Palestine. But here he is at Passover in Palestine. He's in Jerusalem. He's in Jerusalem. One gets the impression that maybe as a devout Jew, not from Palestine, but from North Africa, maybe he had saved his pennies for years and he was making the pilgrimage of his life. And so he just happens to wander into Jerusalem on this day, at the very moment when this dark scene is unfolding. And the Roman soldiers grab him and force him to carry this blood-soaked crossbeam of a criminal who's being led out of the city to be crucified. Would that be impactful to you? I think it was very impactful. Matter of fact, if you read between the lines, there are some things that indicate that Simon was significantly affected by what he witnessed there on that day. Matter of fact, there are strong indicators that Simon actually became a committed follower of the one whose crossbeam he helped to carry. It would also seem then, if you're reading between the lines, that his wife also became a follower of Jesus, and that the two apparently raised some sons, two of whom are followers of Jesus, and that these two sons, Alexander and Rufus, apparently became well-known members of the church in Rome. And of course, Mark was writing for a Roman audience. Now, it seems to me that Mark mentions Alexander and Rufus, the sons of Simon, a North African Jew, because readers would have recognized their names. And it's as if he is saying, you readers of mine, if you have any questions and want to corroborate anything that I am writing here, all you need to do is stop by Alexander's house or Rufus's house, and they'll tell you because their own father was there. He helped carry the cross for Jesus. Now, when you think about this, I think this is why Mark mentions them. Otherwise, there's no reason. It's extraneous. So Mark mentions them as a way of adding weight to what he is saying. Now, one more angle about this before we leave Simon, who helped carry Jesus' cross. This to me is a big thought. Simon is a North African. Did you know that while Christianity is deprecated largely in today's world as sort of the white man's thing, the Westerners' thing, the American thing that we try to transport all over the world, Christianity kind of gets treated that way and spoken of in that deprecating way. And such people demonstrate for me that they haven't really studied the history of the church. Because Christianity was a North African thing long before America ever came to be. You know that, right? All across the coast of North Africa, in Tunisia, in Algeria, in Egypt, in Libya, people were meeting Jesus and becoming followers of his. And some of the earliest theologians of the church came from those countries. At least that's what we call those countries now. So I just kind of want to give props to North Africa here and realize that they were followers of Jesus long before it was a Western thing, which is really an amazing thing when you realize that Christianity has had at its locus first Palestine and North Africa, and then Europe, and then the Western world, and then South America. It's moved. It is a faith for all peoples, and it enters into all cultures with good news. So remember that. It's not your thing. It's our thing. Long before we even existed. And so Simon is one of them. Simon, this North African. Now, I want to shift gears here. Simon carries this crossbeam of Jesus to where? Mark gives it a name. He calls it Golgotha. And Mark is generous enough to translate it for us. It means the skull. the place of the skull, which is probably more for the topographical features than it is for anything else. It's an ominous name, place of the skull, and very fitting for a place where crucifixions would be carried out. And I also thought, well, where's the name Calvary come from? And I bet you a lot of people have never even thought about this, but I'll share this with you because it's kind of significant, because we sing about Calvary all the time. Do you realize that Calvary comes from the Latin word, which means the same thing that Golgotha means? So Golgotha is Aramaic for skull. Calvaria is Latin for skull. Thus, Calvary. So whenever you think about Calvary, sing about Calvary, realize that you're using a Latin word for skull. Kind of significant. Now, you and I live at a time and place where there is great emphasis on what I will call humaneness. And things that are outside of our collective sense of what is humane trouble us greatly. I was just thinking of the current times. I'm thinking about just my lifetime. I've seen a wave of concern about humane treatment of animals, and it's justified. I've seen a wave of concern over my lifetime about people who age or are infirmed, and they seek the dignity to die on their own terms. And you've heard of assisted suicide and such. It comes, at least in part, from a desire to see people treated humanely. Now, I'm not saying I'm on board with any of these things. I'm just saying it's related to this desire to be humane, right? You even hear it every day right now as it relates to people who are migrants and how are they being handled and treated. What are the conditions? Okay. What about capital punishment? Do we do it anymore? And if we say yes, then how is it administered? Is it humane? See what I'm saying? The only reason I bring this up is that this issue of being humane was nowhere on the table when Jesus was crucified. It was the exact opposite, which adds a little bit of context to the fact that God sends his Son into the world at a certain time to endure a certain kind of treatment. And it wasn't a humane one. It was designed to be as inhumane as possible. You realize a great thought and great effort were put into finding a way to torture people as long as possible, in as agonizing way as possible, in as dehumanizing way as possible. And that's what God has done for you and for me. Now, with what I would call almost disturbing economy, Mark simply says this, verse 24. And they crucified him. It's almost upsettingly brief. I came across a paragraph in one book I was using to research this week, and that book quoted another author who was an older author whose name was John Shepherd. And so what I share with you now, I got from one book who quoted John Shepherd. Now, John Shepherd said this: the cross was the most disgraceful and one of the cruelest instruments of death ever invented. It was not only the death of the greatest ignominy, but of the most extreme anguish and suffering. The victim was usually first stripped naked. First, the upright was planted firmly in the ground, and then the victim was laid down on the ground with arms extended on the crossbar to which they had been fastened by cords and afterwards fastened by nails through the palms. Then the transom was raised to its position on the upright and nailed while the body was left to swing, or its weight rested on an iron saddle peg driven into the upright to keep the hands from tearing. Following this, the feet were nailed either through the instep separately or both together with a single iron spike. And there the body was left to hang in agony, sometimes 2 or 3 days. I have read as much as a week, until death ensued. Another author, Geikie, writes that the cross slanted forward and let the sufferer lean on his stretched out hands and thus relieve the pressure of his body downwards. Now think about that. In order to draw breath, the sufferer would be forced to lift himself or pull himself up on the mangled hands and feet. See, this was cruelty by design. It was intentional for maximum agony. Now, for that reason, it seems that an attempt had been made by some of the well-intended women who loved Jesus and were present at Golgotha to do something to minimize his pain by means of what today we would probably call a narcotic. Look at verse 23 of Mark 15. Then they offered, and the they is not very specific, then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he didn't take it. Myrrh is thought to have been perceived as some sort of a numbing agent. When Jesus tasted it, he knew what was up, and he refused it. No narcotics for Jesus. He would drink the full cup, authors like to say, down to the dregs. Now, one of the things that's important as we go through Mark's gospel account of Jesus' crucifixion, for that matter, any of the gospel writers' accounts of Jesus' crucifixion, is to note how the gospel writers endeavor to make it clear that what was happening to Jesus was actually the fulfillment of a divine plan. It's not accidental like some books and movies try to portray it as. The gospel writers want you to understand that what is happening there is what has been prophesied by Old Testament prophets. Now, I want you to see just a couple of ways that Mark does this, okay? And here's instance number 1. And he wants you to make the connection. Mark 15, verse 24b. Mark writes, dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. Now, linger on that for just a minute. I have this weird experience when I have moved, when I've moved from one house to another. I don't know if anybody can relate to this or not. But to me, you know, for all of your stuff to be packed up and be sitting out there on the front lawn or on the back of a truck like the Beverly Hillbillies, you know, there's something about it that's kind of humiliating. I don't know if you've ever thought about that. And it's like sometimes I look at it and I think to myself, is that what your life consists of? Are you kidding me? Is this really what this is about? Or you drive by and somebody has been evicted and all their stuff's sitting out on the curb. Do you not find that somewhat humiliating? It's very humiliating. Here is Jesus. Everything he owns is 2 feet under his pierced feet. He's got soldiers casting dice over him as he's watching and listening. The indignity. He's still alive, guys. Do you see it? Mark wants you to understand what the psalmist wrote 1,000 years before Jesus was hanging on a cross. Here's what the psalmist wrote in Psalm 22. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death. Dogs surround me. A pack of villains encircles me. They pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garments. Do you think Mark wants you to recognize something here? All the gospel writers do. And there's another instance. It shows up in verse 27. Mark writes this. They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Now let's pause on that for a minute. Did you know that the Romans generally reserved crucifixion only for foreigners? And even then, only for slaves or those who had committed the most heinous of crimes. So it wasn't everybody who got crucified. Now that should tell us something about these men between whom Jesus was crucified, because they're not your ordinary robbers. They're not your ordinary criminals. Their offense was a capital one, and robbery is not a capital offense even in Rome. So it tells you about who they were. And we need to make a connection with the guy we talked about last week whose name was Barabbas. And we talked about the fact last week that he was probably what we called a Sakkara. He was probably, today he would have been called a terrorist, who in some uprising had probably killed Romans or was in the habit of knocking off Jewish people who were suspected of being sympathizers. This is who Jesus is nailed up on a cross between. And there is something we're supposed to notice here. Don't miss the irony of lumping in Jesus with such company. See, in a sense, this is what's happening. God made him who knew no sin to what? Be sin for us, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. Jesus is becoming, if you will, one of the worst of us. And Mark, in pointing out that Jesus is crucified between two Sakkari, wants us to remember the words of Isaiah 53, verse 12. He poured out his life unto death and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. Now those words were written 700 years before Jesus was hanging on a cross. Now there's one more incident that Mark seems to want you to recognize as coming from Old Testament prophecy. And it's verse 34. And here's what Mark says. At 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, and then Mark bothers to translate it for you because it was Aramaic. Okay? Mark translates it for those of us who don't speak Aramaic. Thank you, Mark. Which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Does Jesus not know what's going on here? Well, yeah, Jesus knows what's going on here. Do you realize, and many of you probably do, that in Psalm 22, the writer wrote these words? I quote, my God, why have you forsaken me? And it goes on. So Jesus said in Aramaic exactly what the psalmist wrote in ancient Hebrew. Mark wants you to recognize this. He even translates it for you so you make the connection. Now there's more. I believe that Jesus actually said those words because he was doing it to fulfill what had been prophesied by a psalmist hundreds of years earlier. And so that we would make the connection. Now I will say this, that in the midst of what seems to be a dark and heavy passage, there are a couple of rays of light that just shine through brilliant to me. And I want you to see them real briefly here. Here's the first ray of light that I find absolutely breathtaking. It's verses 40 and 41. Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. Now, this is really worth thinking about here. You understand that Mark is going out of his way to underscore the presence of all these female disciples? He didn't have to write this. Why would he write this? These women amaze me. They astonish me. Particularly in contrast to the male disciples John accepted, who were nowhere to be found. Could that have been why Mark bothers to write this? Props to the women. So often female disciples have been ignored, relegated to second-class citizenship. But in the gospel accounts, many times you find that they far outshine the men. They are often the most faithful, the most devoted, the most trustworthy. They become, quite counterculturally, I might add, the very first eyewitnesses. Because in that day, women couldn't testify in court, and yet God makes them the first and most important eyewitnesses of facts that are incredibly important, such as the one Mark points out to us here. Today's passage points out that it was these women who were witness to the fact that Christ was indubitably, indisputably put in a tomb. And specifically, which one? It was not something to be questioned. Now, that is extremely important stuff. Props to the women at the crucifixion scene. Extraordinary. The men are nowhere to be found. And a final ray of light, and it comes in the form of a Roman soldier. Verse 39. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, not that he died, saw how he died, and I infer that to mean the manner in which Jesus died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. And it just struck me that this is probably the guy who's been on duty from the time of the arrest in Gethsemane. He's probably been in charge. He probably watched Peter whack off Malchus's ear, and Jesus put it back on. He probably was in charge over Jesus as he was taken from the hall of the high priest to Pilate and back and forth. He's probably the one who gave the command for Jesus to be flogged. He probably was on duty when the soldiers were all mocking at Jesus, hitting him and spitting at him. And he was in charge of the procession through all the streets of Jerusalem out to Golgotha. He's probably the one that gave the order for the nails to be driven. And here you have this guy who's executed how many criminals? This is his job. This is what he does. He, at the end of this account, sees something that the most religious people in Judaism refused to acknowledge. And he actually articulates it. It's astonishing. He says, surely this man was the Son of God. Let's take his counsel. Let's believe it is so. And let us believe and stake our lives in the fact that he is who the soldier said he is, and that he has done this in payment for our sins. He's given his life for us.